is Gary Sands. Mr. Kelly, thank you for appearing on such short notice. We'll now hear the preliminary remarks from Mr. Macdonald, then Mr. Sands, then Mr. Kelly. Mr. Macdonald, you have the floor.
Much, and thanks to the committee to present to you today on Bill C-78. Broadly, if there was $1.6 billion to spend, and plenty more if we include the provincial HST portion, there may be better priorities for the federal government to consider. This change for only a few months is unfocused and is unlikely to have a measurable difference on those struggling most this holiday season. For those January and February, we will see an impact on inflation statistics. We're likely to see the inflation statistics for food purchased in stores drop to 2%, or drop from about 2% to 0% over those 2 months. And the inflation statistics on restaurant food may well decrease further and turn into an actually deflationary situation where the prices are legitimately somewhat lower compared to this time last year. But after this 2-month period is over, these two statistics will go right back to where they started, which is 2.5% inflation on food in stores and 3.5% inflation on food in restaurants. Clothing and footwear generally has already been seeing deflation. Prices are falling 3 to 4% over the past year, and the removal of GST on children's versions will likely see prices fall slightly faster in these areas. We, of course, assume that this $1.6 billion benefit is going to consumers, and that is not necessarily the case. There's no requirement for prices to remain unchanged while the GST holiday goes into effect. If prices effectively drop 5% with this GST holiday, there's nothing stopping stores from increasing prices 1 or 2% and capturing a portion of that 5% decrease for themselves, or alternatively, to not provide the same sales that they might have otherwise provided, particularly in January and February at this time last year. Don't pay the GST is a common discount approach that cannot be used this year and might be used a lot less, therefore resulting in higher revenue and potentially higher corporate profits. If we don't see food prices decrease, but in fact we do continue to see them increase over this time period, we will know that a portion of that GST cut has been captured by increased prices and is going not to consumers, but to the companies providing those goods and services. Now, there is likely room in the fiscal framework to spend $1.6 billion in 2024 without changing the fiscal outlook. There's likely in the neighborhood of $5 billion that we could spend and maintain the deficit at roughly $40 billion as projected in the spring budget. Budget 2024 was particularly pessimistic about growth this year, essentially baking in a full-scale recession. Now, at the end of the year, we know that that didn't happen, and as a result, we'll likely come in a full point above projected real GDP in terms of higher, and that'll result in higher federal revenues and smaller income transfers on things like employment insurance, resulting in roughly $5 billion additional dollars to spend in 2024. Now, we will have to wait for the fall economic statement to confirm this if and when it appears, but there is almost certainly room for this GST holiday and then some without changing the fiscal framework. Now, while I'm not necessarily in favor of this measure, I would certainly say the affordability crisis is real, but it is hitting some much harder than others. In some industries, like professional services, think accountants or IT consultants, wages are far above pre-pandemic levels even after adjusting for inflation. However, this is offset in other industries where wages continue to be well behind where they stood in pre-pandemic terms, particularly when we look in real terms. In a time when unemployment is not at crisis levels, we are seeing all-time high use of food banks. The rapid increase in housing costs, particularly rents in the last year, has eaten the rest of household budgets. This can certainly lead to food bank use, which are at record highs, but it is also leading to tremendous levels of visible as well as invisible homelessness in places like encampments, which we're seeing across the country. Rent eats first, as they say. For folks who lose housing or are in a province without rent controls, having to move rapidly can mean homelessness, as rents have risen so much in the past year that it's too hard to get back in. This $1.6 billion GST holiday, or likely $5 billion in rough fiscal room in 2024, could be much more focused and have a real impact on those facing severe food insecurity and homelessness. An effective 5% discount on about half the food in grocery stores is not going to have an impact on food bank use this holiday season. But a focused transfer to those in lowest income, for instance, as determined by a subset of the GST credit recipients, could result in hundreds of dollars this holiday season for those most at risk. In the longer term, we could create a supplement to the Canada Child Benefit, something that we've long advocated for, that could deliver up to $8,500 per child to the poorest families with children and cut the child poverty rate in half. The cost of this supplement to have child poverty is actually slightly less than the combined cost of the GST holiday and the now delayed $250 checks to folks with employment earnings.
Mr. Macdonald.
So, oh yes, small changes attempting to provide everyone with a very small benefit does essentially nothing for those most at risk this holiday season. But spending that same amount of money in a much more focused way towards those in poverty, those using food banks and facing homelessness, can have a much more impactful, have a much more meaningful impact. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Macdonald.